here. And before I ask my question, I just want to thank you for what you're doing. And I guess my first question would be, how are you doing? You've been on the floor for quite a while now, and I really appreciate it. And how do you feel?
Senator Whitehouse, when I was in my early 20s, I actually ruptured 2 discs in my back. So I spent a lot of time reworking my back in my later 20s to make sure that that wouldn't happen again. And that rigorous back work to repair my broken discs is paying off, I would say. I would yield to the gentleman from New Jersey for a question.
You were not asserting that you're still in your 20s, were you, sir?
I am no longer in my 20s, but I'm saying that early preventative work has paid off in the long run.
Thank you. I just wanted that clarification. Thank you very much.
Yield back to the senator from Rhode Island for a question.
We have some obligations here that we ought to meet, and that the American people would support us in meeting. And my question is that, do those obligations include not only strengthening our gun laws to make sure that certain individuals who should not purchase firearms are legally prevented from purchasing firearms? For instance, people convicted of violent hate crimes. I think Americans agree that that's not a class of people whose defense of their right to purchase firearms we should be rushing to defend. Those who are suspected terrorists on the no-fly list, on the terrorist watch list, that seems to be a very reasonable group of people to take out of the list of folks who are allowed to purchase firearms. But if we just do those 2 things and we don't beef up the background checks, so that even if we do create a law that protects people who've committed violent hate crimes from being able to buy a firearm, and even if we do pass a law that prevents people from the terrorist watch list or the no-fly list from being able to buy a firearm, even if those laws are in place, is it not true that if all they have to do is go online to buy a gun, if all they have to do is to go to a gun show to buy a gun, that we have failed in our responsibility to protect the American people?
The gentleman is correct. Today, the estimates are that 40% of all gun sales happen outside of bricks and mortar stores. And the secret's out, that if you can't get a gun because of your criminal record, or in this case, because of your inclusion on the no-fly list, then just circle back and find another way. All it takes is a quick internet search. All it takes is to plug in armslist.com, and you can get a weapon delivered to you in short order. If we don't close that loophole, that internet and gun show loophole, then simply denying terrorist guns at gun stores is a half measure.
Senator Murphy would yield for a question. That problem applies to a convicted felon who can right now get around the restriction and go and buy a gun through either of those loopholes, from online or from a gun show. It applies to a domestic violence abuser who is ordinarily prohibited but can easily get around it by going to a gun show or buying a gun online. It applies to someone who has been determined by a court to be dangerously mentally ill. So right now we have a system, as I understand it, where if you have been determined by a court to be dangerously mentally ill, if you go to a gun shop and go through the regular procedure, then your purchase of the gun will be interrupted. But all you have to do is go to a gun show, or all you have to do is go online, and you get around the restriction. Isn't that the state of play right now, even for convicted felons, domestic violence abusers, and people who have been adjudicated to be seriously mentally ill?
That is the state of play, Senator Whitehouse, and we had Senator Durbin on the floor earlier today telling the horrific tales of Chicago, in which the strong background checks laws in Illinois make almost no difference on the streets of Chicago because the weak background checks laws of Indiana allow for individuals to go there and buy guns online or at gun shows and then ferry them back into the streets of Chicago. And so without that federal law that creates a uniform standard that you need to go through a background check through whatever commercial means that you attempt to buy a gun, then there are criminals every single day who are getting their hands on weapons, separate and aside, as you said, from this question of terrorist access.
So if the senator would yield for another question.
I would.
I have some statistics here that I find a little surprising, and I'd love to ask you about your explanation of them. And the statistics that I have are that 76% of gun owners and 71% of National Rifle Association members support prohibiting people on the terror watch list from purchasing guns. And yet, despite the fact that 76% of gun owners support putting people on the terror watch list on the list that doesn't allow them to buy firearms, and despite the fact that 71% of NRA members support putting terror watch list folks onto the ban list for buying firearms, that nevertheless the NRA has repeatedly opposed and attempted to block legislation that attempts to close the terrorist watch list gap. Do you have an explanation or a thought about why it is that when 3/4 of gun owners and nearly 3/4 of NRA members take one position, the organization is taking a completely different position from what their members support and from what gun owners support across America?
Senator Whitehouse, you've asked the $64,000 question in a way, and I can hazard a guess. And my guess would be this, that the nature of gun ownership has changed over the years. It used to be that over 50% of Americans own guns, and most of them only own one gun, but the majority of Americans actually own guns some 30 years ago. Today, that number is rapidly decreasing. Now, 30-some-odd% of Americans own guns, and it means the nature of the industry is changing. It means that the industry now has to sell a smaller number of individuals a larger number of weapons. And so part of the marketing technique by the industry, and the industry is essentially equated to the NRA, it is the industry that funds the NRA in substantial part. Part of the marketing necessity of the industry is to create this belief in the government any day approaching your house to confiscate your weapons. And so every initiative to just try to enact common sense gun laws is distorted by the industry as just another attempt to get closer to the day in which black helicopters swoop down on your house and steal away all of your weapons. And of course, that's not what we're going at here. That has nothing to do with our agenda. We simply want people who are on the terrorist watch list to not be able to buy guns and for criminals to not be able to buy guns. But because the industry needs this perpetual fear of government in order to sell more weapons, I think that there has been a desire upon the NRA to not listen to its membership and instead listen to its industry members and feed this sense of dread about the secret intentions of the federal government.
And if the senator would yield for another question, it's my understanding that this position that the NRA takes against any and every, even very reasonable gun safety measure, and very likely, I suspect, for the reasons that you have identified, it's a marketing ploy on behalf of the big industry that pays them to do this. But it's my understanding that that applies to a variety of other issues as well. And the issue I'd want to ask you about is the issue of high-capacity magazines. Now, I'm a gun owner myself, and I belong to a gun club in Rhode Island. And in order to get access to the range, I had to have a safety briefing by the gun club saying what I could and could not do on the range, saying what the range rules are. And one of the range rules that was imparted to me in the safety briefing is that they don't allow high-capacity magazines on the range. They don't allow them for safety reasons. So if you have gun clubs around the country, I doubt this is the only one, if you have gun clubs around the country that won't allow high-capacity magazines on the range for safety reasons at the range itself, and yet here's the NRA wildly opposing any effort to limit any high-capacity magazine restriction of any kind, does that follow as part of that same argument? Is the industry as determined not only to sell more and more guns to a smaller number of people by creating fear that some imaginary black helicopter is going to come and take their guns away, but also restricting the limits on high-capacity magazines?
The margins involved for the industry in these very powerful weapons and these large capacity magazines are big. And so when you are attempting to put together a portfolio in which you are going to make a substantial profit in return for your investors, you've got to double down on things like 100-round drums and AR-15 style weapons. Now, I don't know every hunter in my state, but I have still yet to talk to one who feels like they need a 30-round clip in order to go into the woods and hunt. It's just not something that hunters need. And the design of all of these weapons and the high-capacity magazines that we're referring to are originally for one purpose and one purpose only: to kill as many human beings as quickly as possible. They are military in nature and design. And thus the reason why many gun clubs around the country deny access to this kind of ammunition. It certainly stands to reason that the rationale for continuing to sell this is monetary in nature.
And does the senator recall that years ago there was an effort to prevent armor-piercing ammunition from being sold? Because our police officers who wear body protection to protect them against armed assailants were very concerned that selling people armor-piercing ammunition would make them more effective at killing police officers, whereas it would make no difference in hunting deer or elk or anything else. They customarily, as I understand it, don't wear armor, but police officers do. Police officers have to go into dangerous situations with armed individuals, and therefore there is considerable pressure to protect our law enforcement officers to try to put limits on the amount of armor-piercing ammunition that people could buy. And my recollection, if the senator would confirm it, that would be my question, is that at the time, the NRA opposed any limit on armor-piercing ammunition and opposed the law enforcement forces, the local police chiefs and police officers who come to these crisis situations in their desire to be safe, in their desire to be able to tell their families, it's going to be okay, honey, I've got protective armor, it's going to help make me safe, and there isn't armor-piercing ammunition that people are allowed to shoot at me, that they took all that away. And this was an argument that they made and that they've succeeded. And right now, armor-piercing ammunition is available as a result of NRA lobbying.
That's certainly how I remember the events as well. And I would note, I will remember one of the many chilling conversations I had in the 24 hours after the shooting in Newtown, one with a police officer who remarked that it was a good thing that Adam Lanza killed himself and didn't engage in a shootout with police, because they were not confident that they would be able to survive a shootout with an individual who had that much ammunition and that kind of high-powered capacity in a firearm. Separate and aside from the question of armor-piercing bullets, law enforcement has stood with us in our calls to restrict the sale of assault-style weapons and high-capacity ammunition, because even that, without the armor-piercing bullets, puts them at risk.
Would the senator yield for one more question before I see my senior senator, Jack Reed, who is here on the floor, and I'm sure he wants to engage in a question and answer with Senator Murphy. But before that, may I ask one additional question?
I yield to the gentleman for question.
The other question I wanted to ask is that in response to our effort to put people who are on the terrorist watch list into a category where they're not able to go and buy firearms in order to commit the acts of terror for which they are on the watch list, that our friends on the other side of the aisle have suddenly come up with a new piece of legislation that they say is designed to address this problem. My question is, do we know if this piece of legislation has ever been seen before? Do we know if it has been brought up in committee and given any kind of a review? Have they built a track record of interest and concern about this issue and built a legislative record to support their bill? Or does this appear to be something that they whipped out of their pocket at the last minute to try to fend off the sensible provisions that we have long fought for to keep people on the terror watch list from being able to go out and buy high-powered firearms?
It would shock and surprise you to know, Senator Whitehouse, that it appears to be the latter. We had one of our colleagues come down to the floor and suggest that there is a way out of this, that we can come together and work on a compromise. And I think all of us, myself and Senator Booker and Senator Blumenthal, were happy to take him up on that effort. But I noted that we've had 6 months since the failure of the last measure to prevent terrorists or suspected terrorists from buying weapons to work on this. And no one in the Republican caucus has approached us about trying to find common ground. It wasn't until we took the floor this morning and shut down the process on this appropriations bill that we started to see movement on the Republican side about coming up with an alternative. Now, they did pose an alternative back in December, but it was a miserable alternative that would require law enforcement to go to court in order to stop someone who's on these lists from getting a weapon and cap them at 72 hours to complete that whole process. It was ridiculous and ludicrous. They are probably going to present another alternative, but it is important to note, Senator Whitehouse, that none of that happened until we took the floor here, and we have had 6 months since the last vote. And frankly, 3 days since the shooting in which we could have been trying to work that out.
To the point the senator just made, if you yield for one final question, when the government would have to go into court within 72 hours in order to try to interrupt the sale, presumably that would give the person on the terrorist watch list all sorts of notice about the government's investigative activities and an opportunity in court to do further inquiry into the government's investigative activities, and in fact allow somebody who was on the terrorist watch list to have a window into the government investigation that he or she might be the subject of. Is that not the way that that would play out? It doesn't seem to make much sense to me.
It doesn't seem to make much sense, and I think for the question, I mean, we can only imagine what that court process looks like. Who knows what rules apply? Who knows what rights to discovery are
There's no model for it.
involved? There's no model for it, and we have hamstrung the FBI and the Attorney General by asking them to do more and more with the same amount of resources, to ask them to go through dozens upon dozens of court processes. Remember, there were 240 people on these lists that tried to get guns last year. So you're talking about a lot of court processes that they would have to undertake. It's just totally unrealistic, totally unprecedented. It makes no sense at all.